They smile when you walk in, friendly eyes, soft voices, a little too soft. You think it's support, maybe even admiration. But look closer. That smile tightens when you start improving. It fades when you outgrow the version of yourself they were comfortable with. Because your growth, it doesn't inspire everyone. For some, it exposes everything they've been avoiding. See, people don't always hate you for failing. They get uneasy when you don't. When you start thinking differently, moving differently, refusing to stay small just to keep the room comfortable. And suddenly, the same people who clapped for your potential go quiet when it becomes real. A smile is one of the most misunderstood things in human behavior. People assume it always means warmth, acceptance, or support. But in reality, a smile can carry layers that are never spoken out loud. It can be polite, it can be rehearsed, it can be a mask carefully placed over thoughts that would never be shared openly. When you walk into a room and see people smiling at you, it feels safe on the surface. It feels like you are welcomed, like you are seen in a positive light. But not every smile is honest in the way it appears. Some smiles are simply a way to keep things normal, to avoid revealing what is actually going on beneath the surface. There are moments when people smile not because they are happy for you, but because they are trying to stay in control of how they appear around you. The expression stays soft, but the mind behind it might not be soft at all. It might be calculating, comparing, observing, because the truth is, people do not always react to you directly. They react to what you represent in their internal world. And when your presence starts to shift, when your behavior changes, when your mindset begins to grow beyond what they expected from you, that smile starts to carry tension inside it. At first, nothing looks different. They still greet you the same way. They still smile when they see you. But something subtle changes in the energy. Their attention becomes sharper. Their words become slightly measured. They begin to watch more and speak less. And that smile, the same one that once felt effortless, now feels like it has weight behind it, because they are no longer just seeing you as you were before. They are seeing you as someone who is moving ahead in ways they did not anticipate. And this is where discomfort begins to hide behind friendliness. People are comfortable when they can predict you, when they know your limits, when they can place you in a category that feels familiar to them. But growth removes predictability. It creates uncertainty. It forces people to reassess what they thought they knew about you. And not everyone is prepared for that shift. So they smile, but inside they are adjusting. There is also a quiet comparison that starts happening without words. They begin measuring their own pace against yours, even if they never admit it. They notice your discipline, your focus, your direction, and while they continue smiling, a part of them starts questioning their own stillness. That is where the discomfort grows. Not because you are doing anything against them, but because your movement reminds them of their own pause. A smile in such moments becomes a shield. It protects the illusion that everything is still equal, still normal, still unchanged. But behind that shield, emotions are no longer simple. There is admiration mixed with unease, respect mixed with distance, familiarity mixed with silent recalibration. People rarely show this openly, but it is there in the way they look at you twice, in the way conversations become shorter, in the way energy shifts when you speak about your progress. And the most interesting part is, you may not even realize when it starts happening. You just keep moving forward, thinking everything is the same, while others are slowly adjusting to the version of you they are now encountering. The smile remains, but its meaning changes. It is no longer just a gesture. It becomes a cover for what they are processing internally. Because when you grow, you do not just change your life. You change how people experience you. Growth has a strange way of revealing things that were always there, but never noticed. It doesn't create insecurity in people out of nothing. It simply exposes what was already buried beneath comfort, routine, and silence. When you start evolving, when your mindset begins to sharpen, when your actions start reflecting discipline instead of distraction, something subtle shifts in the people around you. Not everyone reacts with words. Some react with behavior, some with silence, and some with a kind of discomfort they cannot explain even to themselves. In the beginning, it looks normal. People still talk the same way, still act familiar, still maintain the same expressions. But growth does not need loud signals to be felt. It is detected in small changes. The way you carry yourself becomes different. The way you respond becomes more intentional. The way you stop needing validation becomes noticeable. And without saying anything directly, you start reflecting something that others begin to compare themselves against. Insecurity does not always come from weakness. Sometimes it comes from awareness. When someone realizes that they are not moving while someone else is, it creates a quiet pressure inside them. Not everyone knows how to process that pressure. Some ignore it, some deny it, but many begin to feel it in the presence of the person who is growing. They might not say it out loud, but their energy starts to shift. Their attention becomes sharper. Their reactions become slightly more guarded. What makes growth uncomfortable for others is not the achievement itself. It is what the achievement represents. It represents discipline they didn't maintain, decisions they didn't make, effort they postponed. And when they see someone close to them or familiar to them stepping into that space, it doesn't just feel like observation anymore. It feels like comparison without permission. There is a silent mirror effect that happens. Your progress becomes a reflection they didn't ask to see. It forces them to look at their own habits, their own delays, their own excuses, and that reflection is not always easy to accept. So instead of confronting it directly, many people shift internally. They begin to distance themselves emotionally while still staying physically present. They may still talk, still smile, still behave normally on the surface, but something inside them starts resisting the change in you. Growth also changes dynamics without announcement. Conversations that once felt easy begin to feel slightly off. Energy that used to flow naturally starts to feel measured. Some people start speaking less around you, not because they have nothing to say, but because they are recalculating how they fit into your new version. And in that recalculation, insecurity quietly takes shape. It is not always jealousy in its loud form. Sometimes it is quieter. It shows up as hesitation, subtle criticism, or unnecessary comparisons. It shows up in jokes that carry a hidden edge, in compliments that feel slightly delayed, in support that feels carefully balanced. People rarely admit They are uncomfortable with your growth, but their behavior often reveals what their words do not, and the deeper truth is, growth doesn't attack anyone, it simply moves. But movement in one direction exposes stillness in another. That is what creates the tension. Not conflict, not competition, just contrast. And contrast is something many people struggle to sit with quietly. Over time, you start noticing patterns. The ones who are secure in themselves continue supporting you without hesitation, and the ones who are not begin to adjust their distance, their tone, their engagement. Not always consciously, but instinctively, because growth has a way of making people feel like they are being measured, even when no measurement is taking place. And in that space, where progress meets perception, insecurity finds its quiet voice without ever needing to speak directly. Not everyone is built to handle evolution in others. Some people are comfortable with you only as long as you remain predictable, as long as your behavior fits the version of you they have already categorized in their mind. The moment you start shifting beyond that frame, something inside the environment changes. Not loudly, not dramatically, but in subtle adjustments that reveal more than words ever could. People often assume support is unconditional, but in reality, support has limits in many spaces. It exists comfortably when your growth does not disturb anyone's internal balance. But when you begin to rise, when your thinking becomes sharper, when your focus becomes undeniable, that comfort starts to shake, not because you did something wrong, but because you did something different. There is a silent expectation people carry about others. They expect you to stay within a certain emotional and behavioral range. When you stay there, everything feels stable. Conversations feel easy. Interactions feel natural. But growth breaks that expectation without asking permission. It introduces change into a system that was built on familiarity. And familiarity is something many people rely on more than they realize. When you evolve, you start noticing that reactions around you are no longer consistent. Some people become quieter in your presence. Some become more observant. Some begin to respond in shorter sentences, as if they are adjusting their distance without physically moving away. And some continue acting normal on the surface, while internally processing what your growth means for their own position. This is where discomfort begins to take shape. Not because you are competing with anyone, but because your progress forces an unspoken comparison. Even if you never mention your achievements, even if you don't speak about your journey, your results speak for you, and results have a way of entering spaces where words are not invited. People who are secure in themselves rarely feel threatened by your evolution. But those who rely heavily on static identity struggle to process it, because your growth becomes a reminder that change is possible. And that reminder can either inspire or disturb, depending on how someone sees themselves in relation to it over time. You may notice certain behaviors repeating. People who once engaged freely may start observing more than participating. Those who once offered opinions easily may begin to hesitate before speaking. Not because they have nothing to say, but because your growth has altered the balance they were used to. They are now recalculating where they stand in relation to you without openly admitting it. Even admiration can carry discomfort. Someone can respect your progress and still feel uneasy about it. Because admiration does not erase comparison. It only coexists with it. And in that coexistence, tension quietly forms. The kind that is never discussed directly, but is always felt in small interactions. There is also a psychological shift that happens internally in people when they witness consistent growth. It challenges their sense of stability. It questions their decisions. It forces them to revisit paths they chose not to take. And most people are not comfortable revisiting those internal crossroads. So instead, they adjust externally. They change tone, they change engagement, they change presence. What makes this even more complex is that it is rarely spoken about. No one openly says they feel uncomfortable with your growth. Instead, it shows through patterns, less enthusiasm in conversations, slight delays in responses, subtle withdrawal from engagement, small but consistent changes that accumulate over time into distance that feels unspoken but real. And through all of this, you continue moving, often without realizing how much your evolution is reshaping the space around you. Because growth is not just personal transformation, it is also environmental disruption. It rearranges dynamics without asking for approval, and in that rearrangement, not everyone finds their place easily anymore. Not everyone reacts to success with words, but almost everyone reacts to it with behavior. The shift is subtle at first, almost invisible if you are not paying attention. People who once interacted with ease start to change their rhythm around you. Their timing becomes different, their tone becomes measured, their presence becomes slightly more calculated. It is not always intentional, but it is always revealing. When you start moving forward in life, something changes in how others respond to you. Not because you demanded attention, but because your progress created it. Success does not just belong to you once it arrives. It also changes the environment around you. It rearranges energy in rooms. It shifts priorities in conversations. It exposes quiet comparisons that were never spoken aloud. Some people celebrate success loudly when it belongs to others at a distance. But when it becomes close, when it happens within their circle, the reaction becomes more complicated. There is admiration, but there is also evaluation. There is support, but there is also self-reflection. And that reflection is not always comfortable. Success forces people to measure themselves, even when they do not want to. It becomes an uninvited benchmark, not because you asked for comparison, but because your results naturally create one. And in that silent measurement, emotions begin to split in different directions. Some feel inspired, some feel uncertain, some feel pressured, and some feel quietly left behind without anyone saying it directly. What makes this even more intense is that success does not always arrive with noise. Sometimes it arrives quietly, in discipline, in consistency, in small visible changes that accumulate over time. But even quiet success has impact. People notice when your habits change. They notice when your focus sharpens. They notice when your distractions reduce and your direction becomes clear. And once they notice, they begin adjusting their behavior accordingly. Conversations that once flowed freely may become shorter. Interactions that once felt spontaneous may become structured. The energy that once felt open may start feeling slightly guarded. Not because of conflict, but because of awareness. There is also a psychological effect that success triggers in observers. It challenges their assumptions about time, effort, and progress. It forces them to reconsider what they have delayed, what they have avoided, what they have accepted as normal. And that reconsideration is not always welcome. So instead of addressing it internally, many people shift externally. They adjust how they act around the person who represents that change. Sometimes it appears as distance, sometimes as silence, sometimes as reduced engagement, and sometimes as overly controlled interaction that feels different from before. Even if nothing is explicitly said, the shift is rarely explained, but it is consistently felt. Success also has a way of revealing hierarchy that was never formally established. People begin to unconsciously place themselves in relation to you based on your progress. Some elevate you in their perception. Some step back emotionally. Some continue interacting, but with a different kind of awareness that wasn't there before. Even compliments can carry complexity in such moments. They may sound supportive, but sometimes they are layered with comparison. Not necessarily negativity, but awareness that things have changed. That you are no longer in the same position you once were in their mental picture. And through all of this, the most interesting part is that you might still feel like the same person inside, but outside perception does not always match internal identity. People respond to what they see evolving, not necessarily to what you feel becoming. Success does not only change your path forward, it changes how people walk alongside you, how they adjust their pace, how they decide whether to move closer or create space, how they silently process the version of you that no longer fits the older expectations they once held without ever stating them directly. Silence is rarely empty. It only looks that way from the outside. In reality, silence carries weight, meaning, and reaction that people often fail to notice. When someone stops responding the way they used to, when conversations become shorter, when energy feels less expressive, it is easy to assume nothing is happening. But silence is not absence. It is response without noise. As you grow, silence starts to appear in places where words once existed. People who used to speak freely around you begin to pause more. They start choosing words carefully. They start responding less instantly. Not because they have nothing to say, but because something has changed in how they perceive the space between you and them. Silence often begins where comparison starts. When people observe your progress, even if they do not comment on it, they begin processing it internally. And internal processing does not always translate into speech. Sometimes it turns into quiet observation. Sometimes it turns into distance. Sometimes it turns into reduced engagement without explanation. There is a strange power in not saying anything, because silence removes clarity for others. It does not confirm approval or disapproval. It simply exists, and in that existence, people begin to interpret it in their own way. Some see respect in it. Some see hesitation. Some see discomfort. But none of those interpretations are fully spoken. When you change, silence around you also changes shape. Conversations that used to be open may start feeling structured. Interactions that used to feel light may start feeling heavier. Not because anything negative was said, but because something unspoken has entered the space. People often underestimate how much they communicate without words. A pause in response, a delay in message, a lack of enthusiasm in tone, all of these become forms of silence that carry meaning. And when those patterns begin to shift, It becomes noticeable even without direct confrontation. Silence can also be a form of processing. When someone sees your growth and does not know how to respond, they may withdraw into themselves, not out of rejection, but out of recalibration. They are trying to adjust their internal understanding of who you are becoming compared to who you were before. And in that recalibration, distance often forms, not always physical distance, but emotional spacing, the kind where presence remains, but depth reduces, where interaction continues, but intensity lowers, where connection still exists, but expression becomes limited. What makes silence powerful is that it does not argue. It does not challenge. It simply changes the atmosphere, and that change forces others to fill the gaps with their own assumptions. Some assume everything is fine. Some assume something is wrong. Some assume growth has created separation, but silence never confirms any of it directly. There is also a point where silence becomes reflective. People begin to notice what they are not saying anymore. They realize conversations are not flowing the same way. They recognize that their engagement has shifted, and in that recognition, awareness begins to grow. Awareness of change, awareness of distance, awareness of transformation happening quietly between interactions. Sometimes silence is not about avoidance. It is about adjustment. People adjust their behavior when they feel the dynamics have shifted. They may not fully understand the shift, but they feel it. And when people feel something they cannot clearly define, they often respond with less expression rather than more. Even admiration can become silent. People can respect your growth without expressing it openly. They observe, they acknowledge internally, but they do not always translate it into words. Because silence sometimes feels safer than explanation, and in all of this, you may continue moving forward, unaware of how much your progress has changed the sound of the spaces around you. Because silence does not announce itself. It just replaces what used to be spoken, slowly and steadily, until you realize the conversation is no longer the same as it once was. Not everyone who leaves your space actually walks away physically. Some people remain present, but their version of presence changes. They are still there in conversations, still there in messages, still there in familiar interactions, but something essential shifts. The emotional closeness does not move at the same speed as the physical presence anymore. That is how outgrowing begins. Quietly, without announcement. Outgrowing people is not always about superiority. It is about direction. Two people can start from the same point, share the same environment, even share the same understanding for a while. But growth does not guarantee synchronization. At some point, paths begin to stretch in different directions. One starts moving forward with intention. The other remains where comfort feels easier, and distance is created not by conflict, but by change. There is a moment in growth where you start noticing that certain conversations no longer match your mindset. Things that once felt engaging now feel repetitive. Topics that once felt meaningful now feel surface level. It is not that others have become less. It is that your internal world has expanded beyond the limits of earlier versions of connection. People often misunderstand outgrowing as rejection, but it is not always emotional rejection. Sometimes it is simply evolution. When your thinking changes, when your habits change, when your discipline changes, your tolerance for old patterns also changes. You stop finding comfort in the same spaces, not because they are wrong, but because they no longer align with who you are becoming. And this is where silence begins to form between people who once shared everything openly. Not a dramatic silence, but a gradual reduction in depth. Conversations still happen, but they lose layers. Interaction still exists, but it becomes more predictable. The emotional exchange that once felt natural starts requiring effort, and over time, that effort feels unnecessary. Outgrowing also creates invisible emotional distance. You may still care about people, still respect them, still remember the connection, but the intensity of alignment begins to fade. You no longer resonate with the same struggles, the same limitations, the same mindset cycles. And when resonance fades, interaction becomes lighter. Even if the history remains strong, there is also a quiet internal conflict that people experience when they realize they are being outgrown. It does not always surface as words. Sometimes it appears as withdrawal, sometimes as reduced communication, sometimes as subtle avoidance. Because being around someone who is evolving can trigger awareness of stagnation, and not everyone is ready to face that reflection. On the other side, the person who is growing may not even realize they are outgrowing others in real time. They are focused on improvement, discipline, direction, and consistency. They are not tracking emotional distance, they are tracking progress. And by the time they notice the shift in relationships, it has already been forming quietly over time. What makes outgrowing difficult is that it rarely comes with closure. There is no clear ending, no final conversation, no defined separation. It happens in fragments, in delayed replies, in reduced enthusiasm, in conversations that no longer last as long as they used to, in energy that feels slightly disconnected even when words remain the same. Some people stay in your life in a different form after being outgrown. They become familiar instead of close, present instead of involved, recognized instead of deeply connected. And that transformation is not always spoken about, but it is always felt in how interactions evolve over time. Outgrowing is also not a single event. It is a continuous process. As you grow further, you may keep outgrowing different versions of people, different stages of relationships, different levels of connection, because growth does not move backward to maintain balance. It moves forward and redefines everything around it, and in that forward movement, what remains is not always separation, but transformation of distance itself, where presence no longer guarantees closeness, and history no longer guarantees alignment.